Millionaire pretended to be the cleaner and see how her fiancé's family treated her. Elizabeth Morgan took one last look in the mirror before leaving her luxurious penthouse. Her reflection showed the image of an elegant and confident woman dressed in a designer suit that screamed success with every stitch. However, in a matter of minutes, that image would change drastically. With a sigh, Elizabeth picked up her suitcase and headed for the private elevator. As she descended the 40 floors of the skyscraper that housed the headquarters of Fiancé'S Solutions, her mind traveled to the past, to memories of her mother, Maria. Elena, a woman with calloused hands and a warm smile, had been the pillar of Elizabeth's life every night. Upon returning from long days cleaning the homes of the rich, Maria Elena would hug her daughter and whisper, "My child, you will go further than I ever dreamed." Those words had become Elizabeth's mantra, propelling her through nights of endless study, hard-won scholarships, and finally to the top of the corporate world. Now at 35, Elizabeth was the CEO of one of the country's most important technology companies. The ding of the elevator brought her back to the present. Elizabeth stepped out into the underground parking garage, where her chauffeur was waiting next to a luxurious black sedan. "Good morning, Miss Morgan," the man greeted with a bow. "Good morning, Charles," Elizabeth replied with a warm smile. "I won't be needing your services today. I'll take a taxi." The chauffeur looked at her confused but nodded respectfully. "As you wish, miss." Elizabeth walked towards the parking garage exit, her heart pounding. What she was about to do was risky, possibly crazy, but she felt it was necessary. She hailed a taxi and gave an address on the outskirts of the city. During the journey, she took out her phone and sent a message to Robert, her boyfriend of the last 6 months. "Honey, I'm on my way. I can't wait to meet your family. I love you." She put away the phone and closed her eyes, allowing herself a moment of doubt. Was she doing the right thing? Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. "Sometimes, my child, to see the truth, you have to look from below." The taxi stopped in front of a modest apartment building. Elizabeth paid the fare and entered the building. On the 3rd floor, she knocked on the door of apartment 3C. An older woman with a kind face opened the door. "Elizabeth, dear, come in, come in." "Thank you, Mrs. Carter," said Elizabeth, entering. The small apartment Mrs. Carter had been a friend of her mother's, a companion in the daily struggle of domestic cleaning. Now retired, she had become Elizabeth's confidant and accomplice in this risky plan. "Are you sure about this, my child?" Mrs. Carter asked as she closed the door. Elizabeth nodded, her determination visible in her eyes. "I need to know the truth, Carol. I need to see if Robert and his family can see beyond appearances." With a sigh of resignation, Mrs. Carter guided her to the bedroom. On the bed lay a cleaning uniform, identical to the one her mother used to wear. Elizabeth began to undress, leaving behind her designer suit and expensive jewelry. With each item of clothing she removed, she felt she was shedding a layer of her current identity. As she put on the uniform, a shiver ran down her spine. For a moment, she saw her mother's reflection in the mirror, and her eyes filled with tears. "Mom," she whispered, "this is for you, to honor your memory and everything you taught me." Mrs. Carter entered with a gray-haired wig and thick-framed glasses. With skill, she transformed Elizabeth's face, adding some subtle wrinkles with makeup. When she finished, Elizabeth barely recognized herself. The CEO of Fiancé'S Solutions had disappeared, and in her place was a woman who could have been her mother's co-worker. "Remember," said Mrs. Carter, as she handed her a worn-out suitcase, "your name is Rose Gutierrez. You're 50 years old and have worked in cleaning all your life. Take care, my child." Elizabeth hugged the older woman, silently thanking her for her help and understanding. Then, with one last glance in the mirror, she left the apartment. On the street, she hailed another taxi. This time, when she gave the address of the Williams mansion, the driver looked at her with a mixture of surprise and disdain. As the taxi made its way through the city, Elizabeth closed her eyes and took a deep breath. The expensive perfume had been replaced by the smell of cheap detergent, a scent that instantly transported her to her childhood. I'm going to uncover the truth, Mom, she thought. For you, for me, and for all the women who have been underestimated because of their work. The taxi entered the exclusive neighborhood where Robert's family lived. Imposing mansions rose on both sides of the street, each more ostentatious than the last. Finally, the vehicle stopped in front of a wrought iron gate. Elizabeth paid the fare, ignoring the driver's curious look, and got out of the taxi. Before her stood the Williams mansion, an imposing three-story structure with white columns and perfectly manicured gardens. Elizabeth took a deep breath, clinging to the worn-out suitcase as if it were a shield. With determined steps, she approached the intercom next to the gate and pressed the button. "Williams residence, how may I help you?" A female voice responded. "Good morning," said Elizabeth, surprised at how different her voice sounded. "I'm Rose Gutierrez, the new cleaning lady." There was a moment of silence before the voice responded, "Ah, yes, come in." The gate opened with an electric buzz, and Elizabeth took the first step into the unknown. As she walked along the gravel path towards the main entrance, her heart was pounding. "Here we go," she muttered to herself. "Let the show begin." Elizabeth, now in her role as Rose Gutierrez, stopped in front of the imposing main door of the Williams mansion. Before she could knock, the door opened, revealing a middle-aged woman with an elegant bearing and a penetrating gaze. "So you're the new one," the woman said, scrutinizing her from head to toe. "I'm Martha Williams, the lady of the Tay house." Elizabeth slightly bowed her head, adopting a submissive posture that went against every fiber of her being. "Pleased to meet you, Mrs. Williams. I'm Rose Gutierrez." Martha made a dismissive gesture with her hand. "Yes, yes, come in at once, we don't have all day." Following Martha into the mansion, Elizabeth marveled at the opulence that surrounded her: crystal chandeliers, original works of art, and period furniture decorated every corner. However, beneath all that beauty, Elizabeth perceived a coldness that chilled her blood. "Listen carefully," Martha began, turning abruptly. "In this house, we have very high standards. I expect perfection in every task. One mistake, and you'll be back on the street. Understood?" Elizabeth nodded, biting her tongue to avoid responding. This was exactly the kind of attitude she had expected to find, but experiencing it firsthand was something else entirely. "Good," Martha continued. "Camilla will show you your duties, and remember, keep your eyes on your work and your ears shut. What happens in this house stays in this house." As if summoned, a young woman in her early 20s appeared in the hallway. Her uniform, though similar to Elizabeth's, seemed neater, and she wore an impeccably white apron. "Camilla, show Rose her tasks and make sure she understands how we do things here," Martha ordered. Before disappearing down a side hallway, Camilla gave Elizabeth a compassionate look. "Come with me. I'll show you the house." As they toured the mansion, Camilla explained the daily tasks and the family's expectations. Elizabeth listened attentively, absorbing every detail not only of her responsibilities, but also of the dynamics of the house. "And here is Master Robert's room," said Camilla, stopping in front of a door on the second floor. "He's Mrs. Martha's son. He's different from the rest of the family." Elizabeth felt her heart race. "Different in what way?" she asked, trying to maintain a casual tone. Camilla lowered her voice. "He's kind. He treats everyone with respect, even us. But be careful, Mrs. Martha doesn't approve of him being too close to the staff." At that moment, the door opened and Robert came out of the room. Elizabeth held her breath, fearing being recognized despite her disguise. Robert smiled warmly at them. "Hello, Camilla, and you must be the new employee, right?" Elizabeth nodded, keeping her head down. "Yes, sir, Rose Gutierrez at your service." "Please call me Robert," he said, extending his hand. "Welcome to our home." Elizabeth took his hand, feeling the familiar warmth of his touch. For a moment, their gazes met, and she feared he might see through her disguise. But Robert simply smiled and went on his way. "See what I mean?" Camilla whispered once Robert had moved away. "He's different, but don't get used to it. Mrs. Martha is in charge here." They continued the tour, and with each room they cleaned, each conversation Elizabeth overheard, she felt she was delving deeper into a world of appearances and secrets. At the end of the day, Exhausted both physically and emotionally, Elizabeth retired to the small service room they had assigned her. She closed the door and collapsed on the narrow bed, finally allowing herself to let out a long sigh. She took out her personal phone, hidden in a secret compartment of her suitcase, and saw several messages from Robert, asking why she hadn't arrived yet. With a lump in her throat, she wrote a response. "I'm sorry, honey. An emergency came up at the company. I'll arrive in a few days. I love you." She put away the phone and stared at the ceiling, questioning for the first time the wisdom of her plan. Was all this worth it? Was she betraying Robert's trust? But then she remembered Martha's look of disdain, Camilla's warning, and reaffirmed her decision. She needed to know the truth, needed to understand the world Robert had grown up in and the forces that shaped him. "Mom," she whispered in the darkness, "give me strength to carry on. Help me see the truth, no matter how painful it may be." With that silent prayer, Elizabeth closed her eyes, preparing for the days to come, days that, unbeknownst to her, would change the course of her life forever. Dawn came too soon for Elizabeth. The strident sound of her alarm tore her from a restless sleep full of confused images of her mother and Robert. For a moment, disoriented, she didn't recognize the small service room. Then the reality of her situation hit her hard. She got up quickly, aware that Martha would expect Rose to be ready to start her tasks at the first ray of sunlight. As she put on her uniform and made sure her disguise was in order, Elizabeth mentally prepared herself for another day of observation and discovery. As she left her room, she met Camilla in the hallway. The young woman gave her a tired smile. "Good morning, Rose. I hope you rested well. We have a lot of work ahead of us today." Together, they headed to the kitchen to begin their morning tasks. As they prepared breakfast for the Williams family, Elizabeth noticed the efficiency with which Camilla moved, anticipating every need. "You've been working here for a long time, haven't you?" Elizabeth asked, trying to start a conversation. Camilla nodded as she beat the eggs for breakfast. "Almost 5 years. I started right after finishing high school." Elizabeth noticed a hint of sadness in her voice. "And your family? Didn't you want to study?" The young woman visibly tensed. "My mother got sick. We needed the money. Mrs. Martha offered me this job, and well, here I am." Before Elizabeth could inquire further, the kitchen door burst open. Martha entered, her critical gaze scanning every corner of the room. "I hope breakfast is ready. Robert has an important meeting this morning and can't be late," Martha snapped. "Yes, ma'am, it will be ready in 5 minutes," Camilla replied. Quickly, Martha turned to Elizabeth. "You, Rose, I want you to clean the study today. Very carefully. There are important documents there." Elizabeth nodded obediently, but her mind was working at full speed. The study could be a valuable source of information as she headed to the study with her cleaning supplies. Elizabeth crossed paths with Robert in the hallway. He smiled kindly at her. "Good morning, Rose. I hope you're finding everything to your liking." Elizabeth lowered her gaze, fighting against the urge to reveal her true identity. "Yes, sir. Everyone has been very kind." Robert frowned slightly. "Please, I told you to call me Robert. I don't like unnecessary formalities." At that moment, Martha appeared behind them. "Robert, darling, your breakfast is ready. You don't want to be late for your meeting." Robert's smile faded. "Of course, Mother, I'm coming." Elizabeth observed the interaction with interest. It was evident that Martha's influence over Robert was strong, but she also noticed an underlying tension. Between them, once in the study, Elizabeth began to clean meticulously, paying attention to every detail. Her eyes stopped on a photo frame on the desk. In it, a younger Robert smiled next to a woman who wasn't Martha. Must be his father. Elizabeth thought Robert had never mentioned much about his father, only that he had passed away years ago. As she cleaned near the desk, a partially hidden envelope under some papers caught her attention. The name Jason Williams was written on it. Elizabeth remembered that Robert had mentioned a cousin, but never in much detail. Suddenly, the study door opened. Elizabeth turned quickly, fearing being caught snooping. To her surprise, it wasn't Martha or Robert, but a young man she hadn't seen before. "Oh, excuse me, I didn't know they were cleaning," the man said, his gaze evaluating Elizabeth from head to toe. "No problem, sir, I'm almost done," Elizabeth replied, adopting a submissive posture. The man entered the room, closing the door behind him. "You must be the new employee. I'm Jason, Robert's cousin." Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine. There was something in Jason's gaze that made her nervous. "Nice to meet you, sir. I'm Rose." Jason approached the desk, his eyes fixed on Elizabeth. Rose, a pretty name for a pretty woman. Elizabeth tensed, uncomfortable with the unwanted attention. "Thank you, sir. If you'll excuse me, I must finish my tasks." Jason smiled, but the gesture didn't reach his eyes. "Of course, I won't keep you any longer, but I'm sure we'll be seeing a lot of each other around here." When Jason finally left the room, Elizabeth let out the breath she didn't know she was holding. There was something about that man that deeply troubled her. The rest of the day passed without incident, but Elizabeth couldn't shake the feeling that there was more at stake in this house than she had initially imagined. The shadows seemed deeper, the whispers more threatening. That night, as she prepared for bed, Elizabeth reflected on everything she had observed Robert caught between his mother's manipulations and his own desires. Martha, obsessed with control and status. Camilla, resigned to a life she hadn't chosen. And now Jason, a new piece in this complicated puzzle. "What have I gotten myself into, Mom?" Elizabeth whispered in the darkness of her room. "Am I doing the right thing?" With these questions swirling in her mind, Elizabeth drifted into an uneasy sleep, unaware that the events of the following day would test her determination and her heart in ways she had never imagined. Elizabeth's fourth day in the Williams mansion dawned grey and rainy, as if the weather reflected the growing tension in the house. As she prepared for another day of work and observation, Elizabeth couldn't shake the feeling that something important was about to happen. Her first task of the day was to clean the living room, where Martha usually took tea with her high society friends. As she dusted the expensive ornaments, Elizabeth heard voices approaching. Quickly, she hid behind a curtain, her heart pounding. Martha entered the room, closely followed by Jason. Their voices were low, but the tension in them was palpable. "Aunt Martha, I need more time." Jason was pleading. "The investments will pay off, I promise." Martha snorted with disdain. "Time is what we least have. Jason Robert is getting closer to that woman. If he discovers what we've been doing..." Elizabeth held her breath. What woman were they talking about? Were they referring to her? "He won't," Jason assured. "I've made sure to keep him distracted. Besides, with the new employee around, we have extra eyes and ears in the house." Elizabeth's heart skipped a beat. Did they suspect her? "Speaking of that," Martha continued, "there's something about that woman I don't like. Rose, there's something familiar about her." Jason laughed softly. "Aunt, all maids look alike. Don't worry about her. Focus on convincing Robert that Elizabeth is not the right woman for him." Elizabeth had to bite her lip to keep from gasping. So that was Martha and Jason's plan, to separate her from Robert. But why? What were they hiding? "I tried," Martha said with frustration. "I told him about the advantages of a marriage with the Vanderbilt girl. Imagine the merger of our companies. But Robert is stubborn. He's in love." She spat out the last word as if it were poison. "Love is a weakness, Aunt," Jason replied coldly. "And weaknesses can be exploited. Leave it to me." The footsteps moved away, and when Elizabeth was sure they had gone, she came out of her hiding place. Her mind was spinning with what she had just heard. Martha and Jason were conspiring, not only against her, but also against Robert. And there was something else, something involving investments and secrets they didn't want Robert to discover. As she continued with her tasks, Elizabeth debated internally. Should she reveal her true identity to Robert and warn him? But if she did, how would she explain her deception? Would he forgive her? Her dilemma intensified when, that afternoon, she crossed paths with Robert in the garden. He was sitting on a bench, his gaze lost in the distance. "Are you all right, sir?" Elizabeth asked, momentarily forgetting her role. Robert looked at her, surprised by the concern in her voice. "I'm fine, Rose, just thinking." Something in his tone made Elizabeth sit down beside him, despite knowing she was crossing a line. Sometimes talking helps. Robert looked at her for a long moment, as if deciding whether to trust her. Finally, he sighed. "Have You ever felt that your life doesn't belong to you? That every decision you make is influenced by others? Elizabeth felt her heart shrink. Yes, she replied softly. I've felt that. There's a woman, Robert continued, his voice barely a whisper. Elizabeth. She makes me feel alive, but my mother, my family, they have other expectations. Elizabeth fought against the tears that threatened to form in her eyes. And what do you want? Robert looked at her, and for a moment, Elizabeth feared he had recognized her. I want to be free, he said simply. Free to love, to live, to make my own decisions. Before Elizabeth could respond, Martha's voice resonated from the house. Robert, where are you? Robert got up quickly. Thank you for listening. Rose, you're different from the other employees we've had. As she watched him walk away, Elizabeth felt her resolve strengthen. It was no longer just about uncovering the truth about Robert's family. Now, it was about freeing him from the manipulations that surrounded him, giving him the chance to choose his own path. That night, in the solitude of her room, Elizabeth made a decision. She would bring the Williamses' secrets to light, but she would do it in a way that protected Robert and gave him the strength to face his family. Mom, she whispered in the darkness, give me the strength to do the right thing, even if it means losing everything. With that prayer on her lips, Elizabeth fell asleep, unaware that the next day would bring revelations that would shake the foundations of the Williams mansion and change the course of her life forever. The next morning, dawned with a deceptive calm, Elizabeth woke up with renewed determination, aware that every action she took from that moment on could have irreversible consequences. As she performed her morning tasks, her mind was working at full speed, planning her next move. She needed concrete evidence of Martha and Jason's machinations, something she could show Robert without immediately revealing her true identity. Her opportunity came that afternoon, when Martha left for one of her social meetings, and Robert was at the office. Elizabeth stealthily headed to the study, aware that what she was about to do went beyond her role as a domestic employee. With trembling hands, she began to search through the papers on the desk, careful not to disarrange anything. Her eyes stopped on a folder marked Phoenix Project. As she opened it, her heart skipped a beat. Inside were documents detailing a series of dubious investments and financial transactions that bordered on illegal. The names of Martha and Jason appeared repeatedly, along with astronomical sums of money. So this is what they're hiding, Elizabeth murmured to herself. Suddenly, a noise in the hallway startled her. Quickly, she took out her phone and began photographing the most important documents. Just as she was finishing, the study door opened. Elizabeth turned, expecting to see Martha or Jason. But to her horror, it was Robert who was standing in the doorway, his expression a mixture of confusion and disappointment. Rose, what are you doing? He asked, his voice laden with suspicion. Elizabeth felt the world stop. At that moment, she knew she had to make a decision that would change everything. Robert, she began, her voice trembling slightly. There's something you need to know about your family, about me. The confusion on Robert's face deepened. What are you talking about? Elizabeth took a deep breath and, with shaking hands, began to remove the wig and glasses that were part of her disguise. My name is not Rose. It's me. Robert, I'm Elizabeth. The silence that followed was deafening. Robert looked at her as if he were seeing a ghost, his face going through a series of emotions: confusion, disbelief, pain, and finally, anger. Elizabeth, what? How, why? He stammered, taking a step back. Elizabeth took a step towards him, her eyes pleading. Robert, please, let me explain. I discovered something about your family, about your mother and Jason. They're involved in something dangerous, maybe illegal. Robert raised a hand, stopping her words. You've been deceiving me all this time? You disguised yourself as an employee to spy on my family. It's not what you think, Elizabeth pleaded. I did it because I needed to understand. I needed to see the truth for myself. The truth? Robert spat, his voice filled with bitterness. And what truth is that, Elizabeth? That the woman I thought I loved is capable of lying to me like this? Elizabeth felt each word like a stab in her heart. "Robert, please listen to me. I know what I did is wrong, but I had my reasons. Your mother and Jason—" "Don't bring my family into this," Robert interrupted, his voice rising. "This is between you and me. I trusted you, Elizabeth. I opened my heart to you. I told you my fears, my dreams, and all this time you've been playing with me." Tears began to run down Elizabeth's cheeks. "I wasn't playing with you. Everything I told you, everything we shared was real. My feelings for you are real." Robert let out a bitter laugh. "Real? How can I believe anything you say now?" At that moment, the sound of footsteps in the hallway alerted them. Elizabeth looked at Robert with panic. "Please, don't say anything. Let me explain everything to you, but not here. Not now." Robert looked at her for a long moment, the conflict visible in his eyes. Finally, he nodded slightly. "Go now." Elizabeth barely had time to put her disguise back on before the door opened, revealing Martha. "Robert, darling." "I didn't know you were back," Martha said, her gaze alternating between her son and the supposed employee. "Is everything all right?" Robert quickly composed himself. "Yes, Mother. I was just asking Rose to clean my room." Martha narrowed her eyes, her gaze fixed on Elizabeth. "Very well, Rose, you may leave." Elizabeth hurried out, her heart pounding. She knew she had crossed a point of no return. The truth had come to light, but at a cost she couldn't yet calculate. That night, as she packed her things in the small service room, Elizabeth reflected on the day's events. She had achieved her goal of uncovering the truth about the Williams family, but in the process, she had put at risk the most valuable thing she had. Her relationship with Robert. A soft knock on the door startled her. When she opened it, she found herself face to face with Camilla. "You're leaving," Camilla said. It wasn't a question. Elizabeth nodded, unable to find the right words. Camilla looked at her for a long moment before speaking. "You're not who you say you are you?" Elizabeth felt the weight of the world fall on her shoulders. "No," she admitted quietly. "I'm not." To her surprise, Camilla smiled slightly. "I suspected as much. There's something about you, something different. But don't worry, your secret is safe with..." Elizabeth felt a wave of gratitude towards the young woman. "Thank you, Camilla. There are things happening in this house, things that aren't right. Be careful." Camilla nodded solemnly. "I will, and you too. Mrs. Martha is not someone you want to have as an enemy." With a final hug, Camilla left, leaving Elizabeth alone with her thoughts and fears. The next morning before dawn, Elizabeth quietly left the Williams mansion. As she walked down the deserted street, her mind went over the events of the last few days. She had uncovered dark secrets. She had seen the true nature of people like Martha and Jason, but she had also experienced the kindness of souls like Camilla and Robert. The thought of Robert made her heart shrink. Could he ever forgive her? Would he understand why she did what she did? As the sun began to peek over the horizon, Elizabeth made a decision. She couldn't leave things like this. She had to fight, not just for the truth, but for the love she knew was real. With renewed determination, Elizabeth took out her phone and dialed a number. After several rings, a sleepy voice answered. "Hello?" "Mary," said Elizabeth, her voice firm, "I need your help. It's time for Innovate Tech Solutions to take action." The following days were a whirlwind of activity for Elizabeth. From the offices of Innovate Tech Solutions, along with her trusted team, she began to unravel the web of lies and manipulations that Martha and Jason had woven. Mary, her personal assistant and trusted friend, had been instrumental in gathering information. "Elizabeth," she said one morning, rushing into the office, "you have to see this." Elizabeth examined the documents Mary handed her, her eyes widening in surprise. "Are you sure about this?" Mary nodded. Gravely, completely. The Phoenix project is not just a series of dubious investments, it's a large-scale money laundering scheme, and the worst part is that they're using Robert's reputation to legitimize it. Elizabeth felt anger growing inside her. Not only were they deceiving Robert, but they were putting him in danger. "We need more evidence," she said. her mind working at full speed, something they can't deny. "There's something else," Mary added, her voice dropping to a whisper. "We received an anonymous call this morning. Someone from inside the Williams mansion wants to talk to you." Elizabeth's heart skipped a beat. "Robert?" she asked, not daring to hope. Mary shook her head. "I don't think so." The voice sounded different, younger. "Camilla," Elizabeth murmured, a mixture of hope and concern flooding her. "Arrange a meeting, but with the utmost discretion." That night, in a discreet cafe on the outskirts of the city, Elizabeth waited nervously. When Camilla entered, dressed in casual clothes and not in her usual uniform, Elizabeth almost didn't recognize her. "Thank you for coming," Elizabeth said, offering her a seat. Camilla looked at her with a mixture of admiration and reproach. "So this is the real Elizabeth Morgan, the famous CEO." Elizabeth nodded, embarrassed. "Camilla, I know I owe you an explanation." "No," Camilla interrupted. "You don't owe me anything. In fact, I think I'm the one who owes you something." She took an envelope out of her purse and slid it across the table. "I found this on Mrs. Martha's desk. I think it's what you were looking for." Elizabeth opened the envelope. With trembling hands, inside were detailed documents about the Phoenix project, including signatures and dates that directly incriminated Martha and Jason. "Camilla, this is why are you helping me?" Elizabeth asked, overwhelmed with gratitude. Camilla's eyes filled with tears. "Because for years, I've seen how Mrs. Martha manipulates everyone around her, how she treats people like pawns in her power game. And Robert, he deserves better." Elizabeth took Camilla's hand. "Thank you. You don't know how much this means. Just promise me one thing," Camilla said, her voice becoming serious. "When all this is over, don't forget about people like me. Those who don't have the power to change things for themselves." Elizabeth nodded solemnly. "I promise you. And I promise you that, whatever happens, you'll have a place at Innovate Tech if you want it." As they said goodbye, Elizabeth felt another piece of the puzzle fall into place. Now she had the evidence she needed. The next step would be the hardest, confronting Robert back in her office. Elizabeth prepared to make the most important call of her life. With her heart pounding heavily, she dialed Robert's number. After several rings, when she was about to hang up, she heard his voice. "Elizabeth?" "Robert," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "We need to talk. It's important, please." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Finally, Robert spoke. "Okay, tomorrow, in the park where we used to walk, at noon." Before Elizabeth could say anything else, Robert hung up. She stared at the phone, a mixture of hope and fear flooding her. Tomorrow would be the day when everything would change. For better or worse, the truth would come to light that night, as she prepared for the encounter that could determine her future. Elizabeth thought of her mother. "Mom," she whispered in the darkness, "give me the strength to do the right thing, even if it means losing everything." With that prayer on her lips, Elizabeth drifted into an uneasy sleep, knowing that the next day would bring challenges that would test not only her love for Robert, but also her integrity and determination. The park was quiet at noon, with only a few joggers and dog walkers. Breaking the silence, Elizabeth arrived early, her nerves on edge as she waited on the bench where she and Robert used to sit during their weekend walks. When she saw Robert approaching, her heart skipped a beat. He looked tired, with dark circles under his eyes, as if he hadn't slept in days. He sat down next to her, maintaining a distance that seemed insurmountable. "Speak," he said simply, his voice lacking the warmth Elizabeth remembered. Elizabeth took a deep breath. "Robert, I know what I did is unforgivable. I entered your life, your home, under false pretenses, but you have to believe me when I say that my feelings for you are real. Everything we shared, everything I told you about myself, about my dreams and fears, was true." Robert looked at her, his eyes full of pain. "How can I believe that, Elizabeth? How can I trust someone who lied to me like that?" "I know," Elizabeth said, fighting back tears. "And if after today you don't want to see me again, I'll understand. But there's something you need to know, something that goes beyond you and me." With trembling hands, Elizabeth took a folder out of her bag. "This is what I discovered in the mansion," Robert, your mother and Jason are involved in something dangerous. The Phoenix Project is not what it seems. Robert took the folder cautiously as if afraid it might burn him. As he read the documents, his expression changed from disbelief to horror. "This can't be true," he muttered. "My mother, she wouldn't do something like this." Elizabeth put a hand on Robert's, and to her relief, he didn't pull away. "I'm sorry, Robert, I know it's hard to believe, but it's the truth. They're using your name, your reputation, to legitimize their illegal activities." Robert abruptly stood up, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration. "Why, Elizabeth? Why did you disguise yourself? Why didn't you come to me directly with your suspicions?" Elizabeth looked at him, her eyes full of regret. "Because I needed to see the truth for myself. I needed to understand the world you grew up in, the forces that shaped you. And I was afraid that if I told you, you wouldn't believe me." Robert sat back down, the weight of the revelation evident in his slumped shoulders. "And now what? What am I supposed to do with this information?" "That's up to you," Elizabeth said. "Softly, you can ignore it, pretend you never knew, or you can face it, put an end to this before it's too late." Robert looked at her, and for the first time since he sat down, Elizabeth saw a glimmer of the warmth that used to be in his eyes. "Elizabeth," he began, his voice barely a whisper, "I want to believe you. Part of me knows that what you're saying is true. But another part wishes all this was a nightmare." Elizabeth completed, "I understand, Robert, and I'm so sorry I never meant to put you in this position." Robert nodded slowly, his eyes returning to the documents in his hands. "What will happen if I confront my mother with this?" Elizabeth took a deep breath before answering. "Honestly, I don't know, but what I do know is that you don't have to do it alone. I'm here if you'll let me be." For a moment, the silence between them was deafening. Finally, Robert spoke, his voice laden with emotion. "I need time, Elizabeth, to process it all, to decide what to do." Elizabeth nodded, fighting the urge to hug him. "I understand. Take all the time you need, but please be careful. Your mother and Jason, we don't know what they're capable of." Robert stood up, putting the documents in the inner pocket of his jacket. "Thank you for telling me the truth, Elizabeth. Despite everything, thank you." As she watched him walk away, Elizabeth felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. She had done the right thing by revealing the truth, but the emotional cost was high. She only hoped it wasn't too late to save not only Robert, but also their relationship. Back in her office, Elizabeth immersed herself in work, trying to distract herself from the uncertainty that consumed her. Days passed without news from Robert, each hour of silence increasing her concern. It was on the 5th day when everything changed. Mary burst into her office, breathless. "Elizabeth, you have to see this." She turned on the TV on the wall, tuning to a news channel. Robert's face filled the screen, his expression serious as he spoke at an impromptu press conference. "It is with great regret that I must announce that I have discovered irregularities in the financial operations of Williams Enterprises," Robert was saying, his voice firm despite the evident tension on his face. "I have provided all relevant information to the authorities, and I commit to fully cooperating with any investigation." Elizabeth watched, stunned, as Robert continued detailing the illegal activities, discovered, not specifically mentioning his mother or Jason, but making it clear that the corruption reached the highest levels of the company. "Lastly," Robert said, his voice breaking slightly, "I want to thank those who had the courage to bring these uncomfortable truths to light. Without their bravery, this would never have been possible." The broadcast ended, leaving Elizabeth in a state of shock. He had done it. Robert had chosen the truth, regardless of the personal cost. Her phone rang, snapping her out of her stupor. It was a message from Robert. "I need to see you now." Without losing a second, Elizabeth ran out of the office. As she drove to the meeting place, her mind was spinning. What did this mean for Robert? For them? When she arrived at the small cafe where they had had their first date, she saw Robert sitting at a table in the back, his posture denoting exhaustion. She approached cautiously, not knowing what to expect. "Robert," she said softly, sitting across from him. He looked up, and Elizabeth saw a mixture of pain and determination in his eyes. "I did it," he said simply. Elizabeth nodded, resisting the urge to take his hand. "I saw the press conference. You were very brave." Robert let out a bitter laugh. "Brave? I don't feel brave. I feel lost." "What happened afterward?" Elizabeth asked gently. Robert closed his eyes for a moment, as if the memory was too painful. "My mother, I had never seen her like that. Furious, yes, but also defeated. And Jason, he simply disappeared. The police are looking for him." Elizabeth felt a pang of guilt. "Robert, I'm so sorry, I never wanted—" "No," he interrupted, opening his eyes and looking at her directly. "Don't apologize. You did the right thing. You showed me the truth, as painful as it was, and I owe you an apology." Elizabeth looked at him, surprised. "You? Why?" "For doubting you," Robert said, his voice laden with emotion. "For not seeing that, despite your methods, your intentions were pure. You were trying to protect me, to show me the truth I refused to see." Elizabeth felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. "Then do you forgive me?" Robert extended his hand across the table, taking Elizabeth's. "Yes, I forgive you, and I hope you can forgive me too. For my reaction, for my doubt." Elizabeth intertwined her fingers with Robert's, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. "Of course I forgive you. I love you, Robert. That never changed, and I love you," he replied, a small smile forming on his lips. "And now, more than ever, I need you by my side. The road ahead won't be easy." Elizabeth squeezed his hand, her determination clear in her voice. "I'll be with you every step of the way. We'll face it together." As they looked into each other's eyes, both felt that despite the challenges still awaiting them, they had overcome the most difficult test. The truth had come to light, and although the price had been high, it had also given them the opportunity for a new beginning, one based on honesty and mutual trust. The days that followed Robert's public revelation were a whirlwind of activity. The media couldn't stop talking about the scandal at Williams Enterprises, and the authorities had initiated a thorough investigation. Elizabeth, true to her word, remained by Robert's side every step of the way, from accompanying him to testify before the authorities to helping him deal with the company's board of directors, who demanded explanations and immediate actions. One afternoon, as they were reviewing documents in Robert's office, now stripped of the family photographs that once adorned the walls, Elizabeth noticed how tired he looked. "We should take a break," she suggested, closing the folder she had in her hands. Robert nodded, rubbing his eyes. "You're right. It's just that every time I think we've gotten to the bottom of this, we discover another layer of lies." Elizabeth approached him, putting a comforting hand on his shoulder. "I know, but you're doing the right thing, Robert. You're cleaning up the company, restoring its integrity." He took her hand, kissing it softly. "I couldn't do this without you, Elizabeth. Your strength keeps me going." At that moment, the office door burst open. Camilla entered, her face pale and her breathing agitated. "Robert! Elizabeth! You have to see this!" she exclaimed, turning on the TV on the wall. On the screen appeared Martha Williams' face, her usual composure replaced by an expression of barely contained fury. "These accusations are completely false," Martha was saying, her voice trembling slightly. "My son has been manipulated by external forces seeking to destroy our family business, and I know exactly who's behind all of this." The camera pulled back, revealing that Martha was standing in front of the offices of Innovate Tech Solutions Elizabeth Morgan. Martha continued, accusingly pointing towards the building. "This woman infiltrated our family, seduced my son, and now tries to destroy everything we've built, but I won't allow it. I demand that Elizabeth Morgan face up and explain her actions." The broadcast ended, leaving the office in stunned silence. Robert was the first to speak. "Elizabeth, I'm so sorry. I didn't think my mother would go this far." Elizabeth, although visibly shaken, remained calm. "It's not your fault, Robert. Your mother is desperate and looking for a scapegoat." Camilla, who had been silently observing the interaction, spoke. "What are you going to do now?" Elizabeth looked at Robert, a fierce determination in her eyes. "I'm going to confront her, here and now. No more secrets, no more games." Robert looked at her with concern. "Elizabeth, you don't have to do this. We can handle this another way." "No," Elizabeth said firmly. "It's time for the truth to come to light. The whole truth." Without waiting for a response, Elizabeth headed for the door. Robert and Camilla followed her, exchanging worried glances. When they reached the building's lobby, a crowd had already formed. Journalists, employees, and onlookers crowded together, all eager to see the confrontation between Martha Williams and Elizabeth Morgan. Elizabeth walked out of the building, her head held high and her posture firm. Martha, upon seeing her, flashed a triumphant smile that quickly faded when she saw Robert, coming out behind Elizabeth. "There she is," Martha shouted, pointing at Elizabeth, "the woman who has destroyed our family, our company." Elizabeth stepped forward, her voice clear and strong. "Mrs. Williams, I understand your pain and your anger, but the accusations you make are false." "False?" Martha spat. "You infiltrated my house, deceived my son." "It's true," Elizabeth interrupted to everyone's surprise. "I disguised myself and entered your house, but I did it because I suspected something wasn't right. And I was right." A murmur ran through the crowd. Elizabeth continued, her voice gaining strength. "What I discovered was a network of corruption and deception that extended far beyond what I imagined. Mrs. Williams, you and Jason have been using the company for illegal activities, putting at risk not only Robert's reputation, but also the livelihood of every employee of Williams Enterprises." Martha paled but quickly regained her composure. "Lies, they're all lies." It was then that Robert stepped forward, placing himself next to Elizabeth. "No, Mother, they're not lies." The shock on Martha's face was evident. "Robert, what are you doing?" "The right thing," he replied, his voice firm. "For the first time in my life, I'm doing the right thing. Elizabeth showed me the truth, and although it was painful, I'm grateful, because now I can correct the mistakes of the past and build something better." Elizabeth took Robert's hand, intertwining their fingers. "We're not here to destroy Mrs. Williams. We're here to rebuild, to do things right." The crowd fell silent, absorbing the scene unfolding before. Then Martha, seeing that she had lost control of the situation, turned around and quickly walked away, ignoring the questions from journalists. When the tumult began to dissipate, Elizabeth turned to Robert. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. He nodded, a small smile forming on his lips. "Better than ever. For the first time in a long time, I feel free." Camilla, who had been observing everything from the sidelines, approached them. "That was incredible. What's next now?" Elizabeth looked at Robert, then at Camilla, and finally at the employees who still surrounded them, many with expressions of confusion and concern. "Now," Elizabeth said, her voice full of determination, "we begin to rebuild, not just the company, but trust, and we'll do it together, with transparency and honesty." Robert nodded, squeezing Elizabeth's hand. "Together." As the sun began to set over the city, Elizabeth, Robert, and Camilla returned to the building, followed by a group of employees eager to understand what all this meant for their future. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time there was hope. Hope for a new beginning, for a company based on ethical principles, and for a love that had survived the toughest test. Elizabeth looked at Robert and knew that, regardless of the challenges they faced, they would face them together. The truth had come to light, and although the price had been high, it had given them the opportunity to build something better, something real. The days following the public confrontation were a whirlwind of activity Elizabeth and Robert found themselves in, the eye of a media storm, dealing with hungry journalists for details and anxious employees to know their fate. In the boardroom of Williams Enterprises, now partially empty after the forced resignation of several executives implicated in the scandal, Elizabeth and Robert faced the board of directors. "We understand the gravity of the situation," said one of the directors, his voice laden with concern. "But how can we be sure that you are the right people to lead this reconstruction?" Elizabeth leaned forward, her gaze firm. Because we're the only ones who know the true extent of the damage and are committed to repairing it, not just for the sake of the company, but for every employee and client who has trusted us." Robert nodded, backing up Elizabeth's words. "Moreover, we propose a complete restructuring, total transparency in all our operations. It's time for Williams Enterprises to become a model of business integrity." After hours of discussion and negotiation, the board finally agreed to give them a chance. Leaving the room exhausted but victorious, Elizabeth and Robert allowed themselves a moment of celebration. "We did it," Robert sighed, hugging Elizabeth. She returned the hug, but her mind was already on the next challenge. "This is just the beginning, Robert. We have a lot of work ahead of us." In the days that followed, Elizabeth and Robert worked tirelessly. They reviewed contracts, restructured departments, and most importantly, met with employees, listening to their concerns and sharing their vision for the company's future. Camilla, who had proven to be an invaluable ally, was promoted to a leadership position in the new Corporate Social Responsibility Department. "I never thought I'd be in a position like this," Camilla confessed to Elizabeth during a break. "I went from cleaning floors to having my own office." Elizabeth smiled, remembering her own humble beginnings. "You've earned it, Camilla. Your integrity and your courage are exactly what we need in this new era of the company." As the restructuring progressed, Elizabeth couldn't help but think about Martha and Jason. After the public confrontation, Martha had disappeared from public view, taking refuge in one of the family properties. Jason, on the other hand, was still on the run one night. As Elizabeth and Robert were having dinner at her apartment, the phone rang. It was Mary, Elizabeth's assistant. "Boss, you need to see the news." "Now," Mary said, her voice urgent. They turned on the TV just in time to see a breaking news bulletin. Jason's face filled the screen, his expression a mixture of defeat and resignation. "Jason Williams, the fugitive cousin of businessman Robert Williams, has turned himself in to authorities tonight," the anchor announced. In a surprising statement, Williams has promised to fully cooperate with the investigation, claiming he has information that will shake the foundations of the business world. Elizabeth and Robert looked at each other, a mixture of shock and relief on their faces. "Do you think—" Elizabeth began. Robert nodded slowly. "He's going to confess everything. Jason was always the weakest link. I guess he finally cracked under the pressure." The following days were a frenzy of legal and media activity. Jason's confession not only confirmed suspicions about the Phoenix project, but also implicated several other executives and politicians in a web of corruption that extended far beyond Williams Enterprises. In the midst of all this, Elizabeth received an unexpected call. It was Martha. "Elizabeth," Martha's voice said, sounding tired and defeated. "I need to see you. You and Robert. It's time we talked." Elizabeth looked at Robert, who had overheard the conversation. He nodded slowly. "All right, Martha," Elizabeth replied. "We'll see you tomorrow." The meeting took place at the Williams mansion. Now silent and gloomy, Martha received them in the study, the place where everything had begun for Elizabeth. "I've been a fool," Martha began, her voice barely a whisper. "I was so obsessed with power, with maintaining our position, that I lost sight of what really mattered." Robert, who had maintained his emotional distance from his mother since the confrontation, felt something soften inside him. "Mother." Martha raised a hand, stopping his words. "No, Robert, let me finish. I've made unforgivable mistakes. I've hurt our family, our company, innocent people, and worst of all, I almost lost you." She turned to Elizabeth, tears in her eyes. "And you, Elizabeth, I misjudged you. I saw your humble origins as a threat, when in reality they were your greatest strength. You understand the value of hard work, of integrity. Something I forgot a long time ago." Elizabeth was surprised by Martha's vulnerability. "Mrs. Williams—" "Martha, please," the older woman interrupted. "I no longer deserve to be called Mrs. by anyone." "Martha," Elizabeth continued, "what do you want from us?" Martha took a deep breath before answering. "I want to make things right. I know it's late, but I want to help. I'll testify, confess everything I know, and then I'll leave. You two should lead the company towards a better future." Robert, moved by his mother's honesty, approached and took her hand. "Mother, I appreciate your honesty, and although the path to forgiveness will be long, this is a good start." Elizabeth observed the scene, feeling a mixture of emotions. Martha's redemption didn't erase the damage caused, but it offered the possibility of a new beginning, not just for the company, but also for this fractured family. As they left the mansion, Elizabeth and Robert paused for a moment in the garden, the place where they had had so many secret conversations during the time Elizabeth was disguised. "Do you think we'll ever return to normal?" Robert asked, looking towards the house that was once his home. Elizabeth intertwined her fingers with his. "I don't think we'll return to normal, Robert. But I think we can create something better. Something based on truth, integrity, and love." Robert smiled, pulling her closer. "You know, when I met you, I never imagined we'd end up here, but I wouldn't change it for anything." "Neither would I," Elizabeth replied, resting her head on Robert's shoulder. "This may have been a difficult path, but it has led us exactly where we need to be." As the sun set over the Williams mansion, Elizabeth and Robert walked together towards their future, ready to face any challenge that awaited them. The truth had come to light, and although the price had been high, it had given them the opportunity to build something truly extraordinary. The months that followed were a whirlwind of changes and challenges for Elizabeth and Robert. Martha's confession, along with Jason's, had unleashed a series of investigations that shook not only Williams Enterprises, but the entire country's business sector. Elizabeth found herself leading not only the restructuring of the company, but also becoming a prominent voice in the fight against corporate corruption. Her humble origins and rise to success, combined with her unwavering integrity, made her a symbol of hope for many one morning. As she reviewed progress reports in her office, Elizabeth received an unexpected visit. It was Camilla, with an expression of contained excitement on her face. "Elizabeth, you have to see this," Camilla said, handing her a tablet on the screen. Elizabeth saw an article from a prestigious business magazine. The headline read, "Williams Enterprises, a model of ethical transformation in business." "This is incredible," Elizabeth murmured, quickly reading the article that praised the company's efforts to reinvent itself and establish new standards of transparency and social responsibility. Camilla smiled broadly. "And that's not all. Look at this." She scrolled down the screen, revealing another article. This one talked about a new scholarship and training program that Williams Enterprises had launched, specifically aimed at young people from disadvantaged communities. "The program you proposed," Elizabeth said, remembering the long discussions they had had about how the company could give back to the community. Camilla nodded, her eyes shining with pride. "We've already received hundreds of applications, Elizabeth. This is really changing lives." Elizabeth felt a surge of emotion. This was exactly the kind of impact she had dreamed of generating when she decided to expose the truth about Williams Enterprises. "Camilla," Elizabeth said, standing up to hug the young woman, "none of this would have been possible without you. Your vision, your dedication, you've been instrumental in all of this." Camilla blushed at the praise. "I'm just following your example, Elizabeth. You showed us that it's possible to do business with integrity and compassion." At that moment, Robert entered the office, a smile on his face. "Am I interrupting something?" Elizabeth greeted him with a kiss. "Not at all. Camilla was showing us the impact of our new programs." Robert nodded, his expression turning serious. "Speaking of impact, I just received news about my mother." Elizabeth and Camilla looked at him expectantly. "She has completed her testimony before the authorities," Robert continued, "and she has decided to donate a significant portion of her personal fortune to charities that work with families affected by corporate corruption." Elizabeth felt a mixture of emotions. Martha's transformation, from being the antagonist of her story to someone genuinely seeking redemption, was something she was still processing. "That's unexpected," Elizabeth finally said. Robert nodded. I think she's really trying to make things right in her own way." Camilla, sensing this was a private moment, excused herself and left the office, leaving Elizabeth and Robert alone. "How do you feel about all this?" Elizabeth asked softly, taking Robert's hand. He sighed, sitting on the edge of the desk. "It's complicated. Part of me is still angry about everything she did, but another part is proud to see that she's trying to change." Elizabeth moved closer, hugging him. "Forgiveness is a process, Robert. You don't have to resolve everything immediately." Robert hugged her tightly. "I know, and I'm grateful to have you by my side as I navigate through all of this." They stayed like that for a moment, finding comfort in each other's presence. Finally, Robert pulled away slightly, a spark of excitement in his eyes. "I have an idea," he said. "What if we organize a dinner? We invite your mother, Camilla, even Mary, to celebrate how far we've come and to start healing." Elizabeth looked at him, surprised. "Are you sure? Do you think we're ready for that?" Robert nodded. "I think it's time. We've spent months focusing on rebuilding the company. Maybe it's time we focus on rebuilding our personal relationships too." Elizabeth felt a wave of love for this man, who, despite everything that had happened, was still seeking reconciliation and forgiveness. "I think it's a wonderful idea," she finally said, "and I know the perfect place." That night, as Elizabeth prepared for dinner, she couldn't help but reflect on the incredible journey she had embarked on, from being an ambitious young woman determined to honor her mother's memory, to becoming a leader who was transforming not just a company, but potentially an entire sector. Looking at herself in the mirror, Elizabeth saw not just the CEO of Innovate Tech Solutions, not just the woman who had disguised herself to uncover the truth, but someone who had found a balance between her past and her present, between her personal ambitions and her desire to make the world a better place. "We did it, Mom," Elizabeth whispered, touching the necklace her mother had left her. "And this is just the beginning." With one last look at her reflection, Elizabeth left her apartment, ready to face the future, whatever it might be, with the strength, integrity, and love that had guided each of her steps until now. The night of the dinner arrived, laden with anticipation and a mixture of emotions for all involved. Elizabeth had chosen a discreet but elegant restaurant, a neutral place that didn't carry the weight of memories from the past. As she waited at the entrance with Robert, Elizabeth couldn't help but feel a twinge of nervousness. This dinner represented more than a simple gathering. It was an attempt at reconciliation, a bridge extended over the abyss of secrets and betrayals of the past. "Are you ready?" Robert asked, gently squeezing her hand. Elizabeth nodded, offering him a tense smile. "As ready as I can be." Gradually, the guests began to arrive. First came Mary, Elizabeth's faithful assistant, who greeted them with a warm hug. Then came Camilla, looking elegant and a bit out of place, as if she still hadn't gotten used to her new status. Finally, with a hesitant step, Martha appeared. The once imposing matriarch of the Williams family seemed to have aged years in the last few months. Her eyes, once cold and calculating, now reflected a mixture of regret and nervousness. "Thank you for inviting me," Martha said quietly, addressing Elizabeth and Robert. Elizabeth noticed how Robert tensed slightly beside her, but his voice was firm when he responded, "We're glad you could come, Mother." The group entered the restaurant and sat at a private table, away from curious glances. For a few moments, an uncomfortable silence reigned, broken only by the soft clink of cutlery and glasses. It was Camilla who finally broke the ice. "Mrs. Martha," she began, her voice trembling but determined, "I want you to know that I don't hold any grudge against you. What happened has changed us all, but I believe for the better." Martha looked up, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Thank you, Camilla. Your kindness makes me realize even more my mistakes." Elizabeth observed the exchange with a mixture of emotions. Seeing Martha, the woman who had once treated her with such disdain, show vulnerability, was surreal. "I think we've all made mistakes," Elizabeth intervened. "The important thing is that we're here, trying to fix things." Robert nodded, taking Elizabeth's hand on the table. "Elizabeth is right. This dinner isn't about blaming anyone. It's about looking forward." Mary, who had remained, silent until now, spoke. As someone who has been by Elizabeth's side for years, I can say that I've never seen her happier and more fulfilled than now. And a big part of that is due to you, Robert, and the changes you both have driven in the company. Mary's words seemed to lighten the atmosphere. Gradually, the conversation began to flow more naturally. They talked about the company's new projects, about the scholarship program Camilla was leading, about future plans. At one point during the evening, when Robert excused himself to go to the bathroom, Martha leaned towards Elizabeth. "Elizabeth," she said in a low voice, "I know I probably can never fully make up for the damage I've caused, but I want you to know that I deeply admire what you've accomplished. You've transformed not only the company, but my son. You've made him a better man." Elizabeth felt a lump in her throat. "Martha, No, let me finish," Martha gently interrupted. "I want to give you something." She took a small case out of her purse and handed it to Elizabeth. With trembling hands, Elizabeth opened it. Inside was an antique diamond brooch, clearly a family heirloom. "This brooch has been passed down from mother to daughter in the Williams family for generations," Martha explained. "I want you to have it, because to me you're already part of this family." Elizabeth felt tears threatening to spill. This gesture, more than any words, symbolized Martha's acceptance, the closing of a painful chapter. "Thank you," Elizabeth managed to say, her voice laden with emotion. "This means a lot to me." When Robert returned to the table, he noticed the change in the atmosphere. The tension that had been present at the beginning of the night had dissipated, replaced by a warmth he hadn't felt in his mother's presence for a long time. As the night progressed, Elizabeth found herself reflecting on the incredible journey that had led her to this moment, from the young woman determined to honor her mother's memory, to the woman now sitting here surrounded by people who, despite conflicts and challenges, had become a kind of family to her. As she watched Robert laughing at an anecdote shared by Camilla, Mary, animatedly discussing the latest developments in corporate responsibility with Martha, Elizabeth felt a deep sense of peace and purpose. This was the kind of success her mother would have wanted for her, not just financial or professional success, but the kind of success measured in healed relationships, in second chances given and received, in the positive impact on the lives of others. When dinner came to an end and the group prepared to say goodbye, Elizabeth noticed that Robert seemed nervous, almost anxious. "Is everything okay?" she asked him quietly. Robert smiled at her, a special gleam in his eyes. "More than okay. In fact, there's something I want to ask you." Elizabeth's heart skipped a beat. Was he going to? Robert took her hand and, to the surprise of everyone present, knelt down. "Elizabeth Morgan," he began, his voice trembling slightly, "you came into my life like a whirlwind, challenging everything I thought I knew about myself and the world around me. You showed me the true meaning of integrity, courage, and unconditional love. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Elizabeth felt the world stop. At that moment, she saw pass before her eyes all the road traveled, her mother's sacrifices, her own struggles, the challenges faced, the truths revealed. And now, here she was, on the brink of a new chapter, with the man she had learned to love despite everything. With tears in her eyes and a radiant smile, Elizabeth responded, "Yes, Robert. Yes, I will marry you." As Robert slipped the ring onto her finger, and the others applauded excitedly, Elizabeth knew that no matter what challenges the future might bring, they would face them together, with the strength and integrity that had brought them to this moment. The months following Robert's proposal were a whirlwind of activity. Between planning the wedding and the ongoing transformation of Williams Enterprises, Elizabeth barely had time to breathe. However, each challenge, each decision, filled her with a deep sense of purpose. One morning, while reviewing the final details of the ceremony in her office, Elizabeth received an unexpected visit. It was Camilla, with an expression of contained excitement on her face. "Elizabeth, you have to see this," Camilla said, handing her a tablet on the screen. Elizabeth saw an article from a prestigious international economic magazine. The headline read, "Williams Enterprises, from scandal to model of business ethics." "This is incredible," Elizabeth murmured, quickly reading the article that praised the company's efforts to reinvent itself and establish new standards of transparency and social responsibility. Camilla smiled broadly. "And that's not all. Look at this." She scrolled down the screen, revealing another article. This one talked about the impact of the scholarship program they had launched, showing testimonials from young people whose lives had been transformed by the opportunity they had been given. Elizabeth felt tears welling up in her eyes. "Camilla, this is exactly what we've been working for." "I know," Camilla replied, her voice full of pride, "and it's just the beginning." At that moment, Robert entered the office, a smile on his face at seeing the emotion of the two women. "What did I miss?" Elizabeth stood up to hug him, showing him the articles. "Look, Robert, all our work, it's bearing fruit." Robert read the articles, his expression becoming serious and emotional at the same time. "Elizabeth, Camilla, this is extraordinary. We've achieved more than I ever imagined possible." The three of them remained silent for a moment, absorbing the magnitude of what they had accomplished. They hadn't just saved a company from the brink of ethical collapse, but had transformed it into a beacon of hope and integrity in the business world. "You know," Robert finally said, "I think my mother would be proud. Despite everything, I think this is what she always wanted for the company, deep down." Elizabeth squeezed his hand, remembering the long road they had traveled to reach this point. "Speaking of your mother, have you heard from her lately?" Robert nodded. "Yes, actually, she called me this morning. She's making progress, the volunteer work she's been doing, helping families affected by corporate corruption. I think it's really changing her." Elizabeth felt a wave of conflicting emotions. Martha's transformation, from being the antagonist of her story to someone genuinely seeking redemption, was something she was still processing. "I'm glad for her," Elizabeth finally said, "and for you, Robert. I know how difficult all of this has been for you." Robert hugged her, gently kissing her forehead. "Thanks to you, Elizabeth, for showing me that there's always a path to redemption if we're willing to do the hard work." Camilla, sensing this was a private moment, discreetly excused herself, leaving the couple alone. Elizabeth looked at Robert, seeing in his eyes all the love and admiration he felt for her. "Are you ready for tomorrow?" she asked softly, referring to their wedding. Robert smiled, a glint of excitement in his eyes. "More than ready. I've been waiting for this day since the moment I met you, even if I didn't know it then." Elizabeth laughed softly. "Even when you thought I was Rose, the housekeeper." Robert joined in her laughter. "Especially then, there was something about you, something I couldn't explain, but that irresistibly drew me in." They stayed like that for a moment, embracing, remembering the incredible journey that had brought them to this point. "You know," Elizabeth finally said, "when I started all this, when I decided to disguise myself and enter your life that way, I never imagined we'd end up here." "Do you regret it?" Robert asked softly. Elizabeth shook her head. "Not for a second. It was difficult, painful at times, but it brought us here. It made us who we are today." Robert nodded, understanding perfectly what Elizabeth meant. "Tomorrow," he said, "when we're standing at the altar, we won't just be starting a new chapter in our lives. We'll be sealing a promise. A promise of honesty, integrity, unconditional love. And of change," Elizabeth added. "A promise to keep working to make this world a better place, one business at a time." "Together," Robert said, kissing her softly. "Together," Elizabeth repeated, savoring the word and all it meant. As the sun set over the city, bathing the office in golden hues, Elizabeth and Robert remained embraced, looking towards the future they had built together, a future full of promises, of challenges, but above all of love and the unwavering determination to do the right thing no matter the cost. And so, on the eve of their wedding, Elizabeth Morgan, the girl who once dreamed of honoring her mother's memory, realized that she had achieved much more than that. She had changed lives, she had transformed a company, and in the process, she had transformed herself. Tomorrow, when she said, "I do," she wouldn't just be accepting Robert as her husband. She would be accepting the challenge of continuing to fight for a fairer, more ethical world, a world where power and wealth were not ends in themselves, but tools for the common good. With one last look at the city sprawling below them, Elizabeth and Robert left the office ready to face the future, whatever it might be, with the strength, integrity, and love that had guided each of their steps until now. And so, with the sun setting on the horizon and a new day waiting to dawn, our story ends. A story of love, of redemption, of transformation, a story that reminds us that no matter how dark the path may be, there is always hope for those who dare to seek the truth and fight for what is right.